September 2nd, 1898. Dawn breaks over the Sudanese desert near Omdurman. 23-year-old Winston Churchill sits on his horse with the 21st Lancers, watching 52,000 Mahdist warriors assemble in a massive crescent formation across the plain. Behind him, 8,000 British and Egyptian troops wait in defensive positions, their Maxim machine guns loaded, Lee-Metford rifles ready, artillery pieces ranged and prepared. What happens in the next 5 hours will be one of the most one-sided battles in military history. 47 Allied soldiers will die, whilst 10,000 Mahdist warriors fall. The casualty ratio, 50-1, wasn't because the Sudanese lacked courage. They charged into machine gun fire with religious fervor and extraordinary bravery. They died because they brought spears and swords to a machine gun fight. This is the Battle of Omdurman, the engagement that proved the machine gun age had arrived and changed warfare forever. It was revenge for General Gordon's death 13 years earlier, the battle that gave Britain control of Sudan for half a century, and the action that launched Churchill's political career. But more importantly, it was a warning about industrial warfare that European generals would fatally ignore when they sent millions to die in similar circumstances during World War I. This is the story of how technology created slaughter on a scale that shocked even the victors. Sudan in 1881 wasn't just another colonial territory. It was seething with resentment against Egyptian rule. For decades, Khedive-appointed governors had extracted crushing taxes, whilst Egyptian administrators ran brutal suppression of the slave trade, which, however morally justified, destroyed economic structures that Sudanese tribes had depended on for generations. Corruption was endemic, cultural insensitivity the norm, and Sudanese Islamic leaders watched foreigners dictate how their society should function. Then a religious teacher named Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the Mahdi, the expected one of Islamic eschatology, and promised to purify Islam and expel the foreign oppressors. His movement exploded across Sudan. Tribesmen rallied to his white banner, calling themselves Ansars, and began defeating Egyptian forces with alarming regularity. By 1884, the Mahdi controlled most of Sudan and laid siege to Khartoum, where General Charles Gordon, sent to evacuate the city, found himself trapped with a garrison and civilian population. Britain watched with growing alarm. Gordon was a national hero, a charismatic officer who'd governed Sudan before and returned out of duty. For 10 months, Khartoum held, whilst a relief expedition crawled up the Nile. On January 26, 1885, the city fell. Gordon died on the palace steps, speared by Mahdist warriors. The relief expedition arrived 2 days later to find Khartoum in ruins and Gordon's head displayed as a trophy. British public outrage was volcanic, but the Mahdi never enjoyed his greatest victory. He died of typhus in June 1885, just months after defeating Gordon. His successor, the Khalifa Abdullahi ibn Muhammad, ruled the Mahdist state for 13 years from Omdurman, the new capital built across the Nile from Khartoum's ruins. The Khalifa maintained strict Islamic rule over roughly 1 million square miles and perhaps 2 million people, but his government grew increasingly autocratic and militaristic. Britain, meanwhile, nursed its humiliation and waited for the opportunity to avenge Gordon. That opportunity came in 1896, when Italy's defeat by Ethiopia and French expeditions toward the Upper Nile created strategic imperatives that coincided perfectly with public demands for revenge. Major General Herbert Kitchener, commanding the Egyptian army, received orders to reconquer Sudan. He was 56, methodical to the point of obsession, and completely ruthless. Rather than rushing south in a dramatic campaign, Kitchener built a railway as he advanced, ensuring perfect supply lines and communications. He defeated Mahdist forces at Firket in 1896 and at Bara in 1898, both battles demonstrating what modern rifles and artillery could do to warriors, armed primarily with close combat weapons. By September 1898, Kitchener's force stood outside Omdurman with 8,200 troops, roughly 1,800 British soldiers in regiments like the Grenadier Guards and Lincolnshires, about 6,400 Egyptian and Sudanese troops trained and officered by the British. 400 cavalry in the 21st Lancers, including the young Churchill, 44 field guns, 20 Maxim machine guns, and several armoured gunboats on the Nile. The Lee-Metford rifles his infantry carried could fire 15 aimed shots per minute at effective ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The Maxim guns could sustain 500 rounds per minute each. The artillery could bombard targets 3,000 yards away with explosive and shrapnel shells. The Khalifa's army numbered perhaps 52,000 warriors with tremendous courage, religious conviction, and about 5,000 horses. Their weapons were a mixture of captured rifles, mostly outdated single-shot models, alongside thousands of spears, swords, and shields. They'd defeated Egyptian armies in the 1880s using mass charges and hand-to-hand combat. What they didn't understand was that Kitchener's force represented something entirely new, an industrial-age army with firepower that could sustain over 130,000 rounds per minute. The mathematics were brutal and simple. To reach British lines, Mahdist warriors would have to cross roughly 1,000 yards of completely open ground, whilst being shot at by weapons they couldn't answer. But retreat wasn't in their vocabulary, and martyrdom was welcomed. The stage was set for industrial-scale slaughter. On the evening of September 1st, Kitchener's force established a defensive zareba, a perimeter of thorn bushes and trenches, with their backs to the Nile, where gunboats provided mobile artillery support. Infantry positioned themselves in layered defensive lines with interlocking fields of fire. The 20 Maxim guns were strategically placed to sweep any approaching enemy with overlapping arcs. Artillery crews ranged their guns to hit targets at maximum distance. It was a defensive position, designed by engineers who understood exactly how to maximize killing efficiency. British soldiers cleaned rifles, stacked ammunition, and tried to sleep, whilst knowing that dawn would bring tens of thousands of warriors screaming toward them. The Mahdists assembled in the darkness, 52,000 men forming a massive crescent intended to envelope the British position. White banners emblazoned with religious inscriptions hung above each division. War drums began their rhythm. Religious chants rose into the night air. Many of these warriors had never fought British troops before. They remembered victories against Egyptians and believed that faith and numbers would prevail as they had in the 1880s. But the Egyptian armies they'd defeated hadn't possessed Maxim guns. That difference would prove fatal. Dawn on September 2nd revealed a sight that awed even hardened British veterans. 52,000 warriors stretched across the desert plain, their formation 3 to 4 miles wide, banners waving, the morning sun glinting off spear points and sword blades. The sound was overwhelming. Drums, chants, war cries from thousands of throats. They began advancing at walking pace from roughly 3,000 yards distance, maintaining formation, building momentum. British soldiers watched in silence, gripping rifles, waiting for orders. Some later wrote that the spectacle was magnificent and terrible simultaneously. They were about to kill thousands of brave men who had no understanding of what industrial firepower meant. The technology gap requires understanding to grasp why the battle unfolded as it did. The Lee-Metford rifle was a magazine-fed bolt-action weapon firing .303 caliber rounds accurately to 1,000 yards, with trained soldiers managing 15 rounds per minute. Multiply that by 8,000 rifles, and you get 120,000 rounds per minute of rifle fire alone. But the real revolution was the Maxim gun, invented by American Hiram Maxim in 1884 and representing the world's first truly automatic machine gun. It used the weapon's own recoil to eject spent cartridges, load new rounds, and fire again, without any manual operation beyond holding the trigger. Water cooling prevented barrel overheating, allowing sustained fire that single-shot rifles couldn't match. Each Maxim could fire 500 to 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as water and ammunition lasted. 20 Maxim guns meant 10,000 additional rounds per minute sweeping the battlefield. Combined with rifle fire and artillery bombardment, Kitchener's force could project roughly 130,000 rounds per minute into advancing Mahdist formations. The Mahdists, armed primarily with spears effective only at arm's length and swords with similar range, plus some captured rifles that fired perhaps 4 rounds per minute, faced a killing zone 1,000 yards deep that they had to cross under constant fire with no effective way to shoot back. The disparity wasn't just technological, it was mathematical. Every minute the Mahdists spent crossing that killing zone, more than 100,000 bullets were flying toward them. Kitchener's gunboats added another dimension the Mahdists couldn't counter. Armored river vessels like HMS Sultan and Melik mounted artillery and Maxim guns, providing mobile firepower that could enfilade Mahdist flanks from the Nile, whilst being essentially invulnerable to rifle fire. The Khalifa's army had courage in abundance, religious motivation that made warriors welcome death as martyrdom, and tactical experience from previous victories. What they absolutely did not have was any answer to industrial firepower. British soldiers, despite confidence in their weapons, felt the psychological weight of what was coming. Many had fought in colonial wars before, but Omdurman would be different. The scale of the slaughter they were about to inflict would shock even professional soldiers accustomed to violence. As the Mahdist army began its advance, bugles sounded British firing positions. Artillery crews loaded shells. Maxim gun operators checked ammunition belts. Infantry shouldered rifles and waited for the order to fire. The killing was about to begin. At 6:15 a.m., when the Mahdist forces reached 2,500 yards, British artillery opened fire. 44 guns launched shrapnel and high explosive shells that burst above and within the advancing formations. Each shell killed or wounded dozens, but the Mahdist ranks closed up and continued forward. They'd faced artillery before and knew the answer was speed. Close the distance before the guns could destroy you entirely. But this wasn't sporadic cannon fire. This was systematic bombardment that didn't stop. By 6:30, the distance had closed to 1,000 yards, and British infantry received the order to commence firing. 8,000 Lee-Metford rifles opened up in disciplined volleys, a continuous rolling thunder of rifle fire. Mahdist warriors began falling in waves, but the charge maintained momentum. Survivors stepped over bodies and kept running toward the British lines, religious chants mixing with screams of the wounded. They were extraordinarily brave men charging towards certain death because their faith demanded it. At 800 yards, the Maxim guns engaged. The sound was distinctive, a rapid mechanical staccato completely unlike rifle fire. 20 Maxims began sweeping the Mahdist formations with sustained automatic fire, each gun spitting 500 rounds per minute. The effect was devastating. Where rifle fire killed individuals, Maxim guns cut swaths through entire groups like an industrial scythe through wheat. Warriors fell in clusters, the continuous fire never pausing. The psychological impact on men who'd never heard machine guns was profound terror. But they kept advancing because retreat meant dishonor, and death meant paradise. The closest Mahdist warriors reached roughly 300 yards before the intensity of fire became absolutely insurmountable. British artillery switched to canister shot, essentially giant shotguns loaded with metal fragments. Rifles fired at maximum rate. Maxim guns traversed back and forth across the killing ground. Thousands of Mahdist warriors lay dead or wounded on the plain, and not a single attacker reached closer than 300 yards to British lines. The first assault was completely broken. British casualties numbered fewer than 20. Around 7:30, the Mahdist centre attempted a second wave, trying to hit the British flank from a different angle. The result was identical. Artillery, rifles, and Maxim guns created an impenetrable wall of lead. This assault collapsed at roughly 500 yards. By 8 a.m., estimates suggested 5,000 Mahdist dead and perhaps 3,000 wounded in just 2 hours of fighting. The plain was carpeted with bodies. Some British accounts describe being unable to see the ground itself for the density of casualties. Even professional soldiers hardened by colonial warfare were visibly shaken by the scale of the slaughter they'd inflicted. Kitchener's gunboats added to the carnage, bombarding Mahdist flanks from the Nile with impunity. The Khalifa's warriors had no weapons that could threaten armored vessels, so the gunboats fired continuously into formations that couldn't effectively respond. It was systematic, methodical, industrial killing. At 8 a.m., convinced the Mahdist army was broken, Kitchener ordered his force to advance toward Omdurman itself. Leaving the defensive Zariba was risky, but the Mahdists appeared finished. It seemed the battle was won. But Kitchener's decision to advance would lead directly to the battle's most famous moment, and nearly to disaster. The 21st Lancers, who'd watched the infantry and artillery do all the fighting, were finally about to get their chance for glory. What happened next would be spectacular, foolish, and would nearly cost young Winston Churchill his life. The cavalry charge that followed would prove that even in the machine gun age, old-fashioned courage and old-fashioned stupidity could still get soldiers killed in the most traditional way possible. The 21st Lancers were frustrated. 400 cavalrymen had travelled thousands of miles to Sudan, and so far they'd done nothing but watch infantry and artillery slaughter the enemy from comfortable distances. Cavalry regiments prided themselves on shock action and glorious charges, not standing idle whilst machine guns did the work. Among the officers was 23-year-old Winston Churchill, who'd wangled his way into the regiment both as a Morning Post correspondent and as a serving officer. He'd seen action in India and Cuba already, but this was his chance for the kind of dramatic cavalry engagement that made reputations and launched political careers. Around 9 a.m., Colonel Martin received orders to scout toward Omdurman and screen the British advance. The Lancers moved south across broken terrain with low hills and scrub brush that limited visibility. They were hunting stragglers and ensuring no Mahdist forces threatened the British flank. At 9:20, they crested a rise and spotted what appeared to be a small group of perhaps 150 Mahdist warriors who seemed to be retreating. It looked like a perfect opportunity. Scatter some fleeing enemy, demonstrate cavalry effectiveness, win a bit of glory. Colonel Martin made his decision instantly. "Lancers, prepare to charge." 400 horsemen formed into line, lances levelled, building from trot to canter to full gallop. The distance was only 300 yards. This should be simple: ride down a small group of disorganized stragglers. But at 50 yards out, disaster revealed itself. A khor, a dry riverbed hidden by the terrain, suddenly became visible, and rising from it were not 150 men, but between 2,000 and 3,000 Mahdist warriors who'd been sheltering there. The Lancers were charging at full gallop directly into a force 10 times larger than expected, and momentum made stopping impossible. The collision at 9:23 a.m. was catastrophic. Lancers crashed into massed Mahdists packed into the khor, and what followed was 2 minutes of the most savage hand-to-hand fighting imaginable. Lances shattered on impact, swords came out, Mahdist spears and blades pulled riders from horses. Churchill, whose injured shoulder prevented him using a lance, fired his Mauser pistol at point-blank range into warriors trying to drag him down. His horse was struck multiple times, but somehow kept moving. Men and horses screamed. Blood covered everything. Some Lancers were literally hacked apart. Others fought desperately just to stay mounted. The regiment's momentum carried survivors through the khor and out the other side, scattered and shocked. 21 Lancers lay dead, 50 were wounded, nearly 20% casualties in 2 minutes of fighting. Mahdist losses in the melee were roughly 200 killed. The charge was simultaneously suicidally brave and tactically idiotic. Martin should have scouted properly before committing to a charge. Instead, he'd led his regiment into a trap through sheer recklessness. 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded for bravery, which was richly deserved. But the charge proved what Omdurman's earlier fighting had already demonstrated. Old cavalry tactics were obsolete. If the Mahdists in that khor had possessed even 2 Maxim guns, the 21st Lancers would have been annihilated before reaching the position. Churchill's detailed account of the charge, published in the Morning Post and later in his book, The River War, dramatically increased his public profile. He described it as the most dangerous moment of his life, calling it like hitting a wall. Years later, he'd also call it the last great cavalry charge of the British Army, recognizing that Omdurman marked the end of an era. Cavalry charges might still happen, but the machine gun had rendered them suicidal anachronisms. While the lancers reformed and counted their casualties, Kitchener's infantry was methodically closing on Omdurman itself. The Khalifa's army was broken, but some warriors refused to surrender. What followed would be the final demonstration of what industrial firepower meant when applied without mercy to brave men armed with obsolete weapons. By 10 a.m., British infantry advanced in perfect formation toward Omdurman, whilst scattered Mahdist groups fought desperate rearguard actions. These weren't retreats. Many warriors fought to the death in small clusters, refusing surrender even when surrounded. British response was methodical elimination. Artillery spotted a pocket of resistance, shelled it, infantry advanced, Maxim guns swept any survivors. There was efficiency, but no mercy in it. The Khalifa attempted one final stand with his Black Flag Division, elite troops who'd served as his personal bodyguard. Perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 warriors remained combat effective, forming defensive lines near Omdurman. Religious duty demanded they fight. Surrender would dishonor both their faith and their fallen comrades. So they prepared to die. At 11, British artillery began bombarding their positions with systematic precision. When Mahdist warriors attempted charges, they were shot down at 300 yards or more. Not one reached British lines. By noon, organized resistance had completely collapsed. The Khalifa fled into the desert with survivors. He'd be hunted down and killed in November 1899, and British troops entered Omdurman unopposed. Terrified civilians hid in their homes whilst foreign soldiers occupied their city. The killing didn't entirely stop with the battle's end. Thousands of wounded Mahdists lay scattered across miles of desert. Kitchener's orders regarding their treatment remain ambiguous and controversial. Some British accounts mention wounded Mahdists being shot to prevent them attacking medical orderlies or feigning death before striking. Other accounts suggest simple neglect. Insufficient medical resources meant wounded enemies received no treatment and died slowly. The exact number who perished from wounds and lack of care is unknown, but estimates suggest thousands. Modern scholars debate whether this constituted war crimes under the standards of 1898, though by today's laws, it certainly would. The casualty statistics are staggering, even knowing they're coming. British and Egyptian forces, 47 killed, 382 wounded, totaling 429 casualties. Mahdist forces, approximately 10,000 killed, 13,000 wounded, totaling roughly 23,000 casualties. The ratio works out to roughly 50 Mahdist casualties for every Allied casualty. Put differently, for every British or Egyptian soldier who died, 213 Mahdist warriors fell. It's one of the most lopsided battles in military history, and the disparity stems almost entirely from technology. Why such an extraordinary imbalance? The Maxim guns and Lee-Metford rifles could kill at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Mahdist spears and swords required hand-to-hand distance. Those old captured rifles some warriors carried might manage effective fire at 200 yards. British defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire meant Mahdists had to cross 1,000 yards of open ground whilst being shot by weapons capable of firing 130,000 rounds per minute collectively. The mathematics were brutal. They couldn't close the distance before being slaughtered. Professional training helped the British maintain discipline and maximize firepower, but technology was the decisive factor. Brave men with spears cannot defeat machine guns no matter how courageously they charge. Kitchener visited Khartoum that afternoon, crossing the Nile to the ruins where Gordon had died 13 years earlier. He stood on the palace steps, the exact spot of Gordon's death, and symbolically claimed revenge. Then he ordered the Mahdi's tomb destroyed and the body disinterred. Kitchener actually took the Mahdi's skull, intending it as a trophy or perhaps a drinking cup, though public outrage eventually forced its return for proper burial. These actions revealed Kitchener's character, ruthlessly efficient, utterly without sentiment, capable of casual desecration that shocked even Victorian sensibilities accustomed to colonial brutality. Sudan became the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, theoretically joint British-Egyptian rule, but actually British control with Egyptian nominal involvement. This arrangement lasted until Sudanese independence in 1956. Kitchener became a national hero, eventually commanding British forces at the start of World War I before drowning when his ship hit a mine in 1916. Churchill parlayed Omdurman fame into a political career that would eventually make him Prime Minister. The Maxim gun, having proven its terrible effectiveness, was rapidly adopted by armies worldwide. But the lesson Omdurman taught about machine guns would be catastrophically misunderstood. Omdurman provided the clearest possible evidence that machine guns had fundamentally changed warfare. 10,000 men had been killed in roughly 5 hours, primarily by automatic weapons fire. Military observers from European armies watched with great interest and drew a conclusion that would cost millions of lives. Machine guns were excellent for colonial warfare against technologically inferior opponents, but wouldn't be decisive against modern European armies. The reasoning seemed sound. European troops would use cover, entrenchments, artillery to suppress machine guns, and disciplined tactics to avoid Mahdist-style mass charges. What these observers catastrophically failed to grasp was that the mathematics of machine gun fire didn't discriminate by nationality. When World War I erupted in August 1914, European generals ordered the same mass infantry assaults the Mahdists had used, expecting discipline and elan to carry the day. German, French, and British soldiers advanced across open ground into entrenched machine gun positions and were slaughtered exactly as the Mahdists had been, just on vastly larger scale. The Battle of the Some's first day in July 1916 saw 57,000 British casualties, roughly 20,000 dead, in a single day. Verdun consumed over 700,000 casualties total. Passchendaele killed or wounded more than 500,000. The technology was identical to Omdurman, Maxim guns and variants firing 500 rounds per minute into attacking infantry. The tactics were identical, mass assaults across open ground. The result was predictable industrial slaughter that turned into 4 years of trench warfare stalemate. Churchill had witnessed machine guns' effect firsthand at Omdurman. By World War I, he was First Lord of the Admiralty and later Minister of Munitions. He understood that machine guns had made offensive warfare nearly impossible, which partly motivated British tank development, an attempt to restore mobility to battlefields dominated by defensive firepower. The irony is profound. Churchill saw the lesson at Omdurman, recognized its implications, yet couldn't prevent the European bloodbath when generals ignored that evidence. Kitchener became Secretary of State for War in 1914, correctly predicting the conflict would last years when most expected months. His recruitment campaigns mobilized millions, but he died in 1916 before seeing the war's end. Both men carried Omdurman's memory through World War I, watching machine guns repeat their deadly work on Europeans instead of Sudanese. From Sudan's perspective, Omdurman meant the destruction of an independent Islamic state and imposition of foreign rule for 58 years. The Mahdist movement didn't disappear. Its descendants, the Ansar, remain politically influential in modern Sudan. Sudanese historical memory views Omdurman as national tragedy and the beginning of colonial oppression, whilst British accounts celebrate Kitchener's tactical brilliance. Both perspectives are valid, which is part of Omdurman's complex legacy. The battle raises uncomfortable questions about technological determinism. Did machine guns make slaughter inevitable, or did tactical failures create unnecessary casualties? Omdurman demonstrated that defensive firepower dominated offense, that frontal assaults against entrenched automatic weapons meant suicide. World War I generals ignored this evidence and sent millions to die in attacks that couldn't succeed. Was that ignorance, incompetence, or criminal negligence? The answer probably involves all three. Modern warfare continues Omdurman's pattern of technological asymmetry. Drones, precision-guided weapons, and overwhelming firepower create casualty disparities against less equipped opponents that echo 1898. International law and ethical constraints supposedly prevent Omdurman-style slaughter, though recent conflicts suggest those protections remain imperfect. The fundamental question Omdurman posed, what obligations do technologically superior forces have to minimize casualties, remains relevant when advanced militaries fight less equipped opponents. Omdurman was a warning written in 10,000 bodies across 5 hours of fighting. It demonstrated that industrial firepower had rendered traditional infantry tactics obsolete, and that attacking across open ground against machine guns meant death on unprecedented scale. Europe had 16 years to absorb that lesson before World War I. Instead, European generals dismissed Omdurman as colonial warfare against primitive enemies and marched their own soldiers into identical slaughter, proving that courage and discipline couldn't overcome machine guns regardless of who was dying. So how did 8,000 troops defeat 52,000 warriors, whilst losing only 47 men? The answer is stark. 20 Maxim guns firing 10,000 rounds per minute, 8,000 Lee-Metford rifles firing 120,000 rounds per minute, and artillery bombarding at 3,000 yards created a mathematical impossibility for attackers armed with spears and swords. Technology didn't just provide an advantage, it created a killing zone that courage couldn't cross. The Mahdist warriors who charged British positions were extraordinarily brave men, motivated by religious conviction and national resistance. Their courage was never in question. Their weapons were simply irrelevant against industrial firepower. British soldiers who participated often expressed horror at what they'd done. Professional military pride in a tactical victory competed with moral unease at the scale of slaughter. Some officers wrote of vomiting after seeing the killing ground carpeted with thousands of bodies. This wasn't honorable combat between equals. It was systematic extermination of brave men whose weapons couldn't reach their enemies. Kitchener's tactical execution was flawless, his logistics impeccable, his use of technology masterful. But military brilliance doesn't erase the ethical questions raised when technology creates such asymmetric killing. The battle's real significance lies in what it revealed about warfare's future. Omdurman was the full arrival of industrial warfare, where firepower dominance rendered traditional tactics suicidal. Bayonet charges, cavalry actions, and infantry assaults across open ground, staples of warfare for centuries, became obsolete on September 2, 1898. Machine guns had transformed the battlefield into a place where defense was nearly invincible, and offense required entirely new approaches. Tanks, aircraft, and infiltration tactics would eventually restore some mobility. But the fundamental lesson held: attacking entrenched automatic weapons meant death. 3 lessons emerge clearly. First, technology dominates tactics when the gap is sufficiently large. Superior weapons can overcome numerical superiority, positional disadvantage, and even extraordinary courage. Second, asymmetric warfare's human cost falls overwhelmingly on the technologically inferior side, regardless of moral righteousness. The Mahdists were defending their homeland against foreign invasion, but righteousness couldn't stop bullets. Third, and most damning, ignoring battlefield evidence kills soldiers unnecessarily. Omdurman proved in 1898 what World War I confirmed from 1914 to 1918. Frontal assaults against machine guns produce massacre. European generals had 16 years to learn that lesson and chose not to, resulting in millions of casualties. Churchill later reflected that Omdurman was both the most dangerous moment of his life and the last great cavalry charge of the British Army. He recognized that he'd witnessed a transition point where old warfare died and something new and terrible was born. His later advocacy for tanks and combined arms tactics stemmed partly from understanding what he'd seen at Omdurman, that industrial firepower had changed warfare fundamentally, and tactics must evolve, or soldiers would die pointlessly. For Sudan, Omdurman meant 58 years of colonial rule before independence in 1956. The Mahdist state's destruction and British occupation remained bitter memories. Yet the Ansar movement endured, and modern Sudan grapples with the Mahdist legacy as part of its national identity. The battle that British histories celebrate as triumph is remembered in Sudan as tragedy and foreign conquest. Omdurman matters today because it demonstrates warfare's recurring pattern. Technological advantage creates overwhelming force disparity. Inferior forces fight bravely anyway, and the resulting casualties shock observers who somehow didn't anticipate the predictable outcome. Modern precision weapons and drones produce similar asymmetries, raising identical ethical questions about obligations to minimize casualties when one side holds crushing technological superiority. The grim reality is that Omdurman taught a lesson Europe refused to learn. 10,000 Sudanese died in 5 hours to demonstrate that machine guns had made offensive warfare nearly impossible. 16 years later, World War I killed 10 million in 4 years using the same machine guns against European soldiers whose generals hadn't bothered learning what Omdurman had already proven. The technology was the same. The tactics were the same. The only difference was that World War I's victims wore European uniforms instead of Mahdist robes. Omdurman was the warning. The Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele were the catastrophe that warning failed to prevent. That, ultimately, is why September 2, 1898 matters, not just as British tactical triumph or Sudanese national tragedy, but as the day industrial warfare arrived and the day its lessons were written in blood that Europe would ignore until millions more had died learning them the hardest way possible.